It seems that almost any movie you watch, and not to criticize this company because I do enjoy the films they make, but Disney seems to make films quite often that emphasize, I'm gonna let it go, I'm gonna be myself, I'm going to enjoy who I am and live out my life to the best of my ability. Like, live your best life is a phrase I hear a lot, especially in my generation and especially in the generation prior to mine, not to put any blame on the millennials in this room. But is that true? Should we really just live our best life? And should we just be true to ourselves? And while I think it is important to do what you want to do, I think that is important. I think it's important to live a life that you enjoy. That's good. But is it true that we truly shouldn't care about what people think? Have you ever been told that? Like, don't care what people think. Don't worry about that. And while I appreciate sometimes what that can mean, it's saying you shouldn't let other people's will decide your own. I can appreciate that. But far too often, I think we forget that we may be the only reference point that people have to Christ. And so in my mind, it should matter what people think about us. It should matter how we reflect Christ. So while it is important to enjoy life, to live the life to that God has blessed you with to the best of your ability, that may be important, but what's most important is to reflect Christ in everything we do. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9 is where we're going to be studying today. We're going to look a little bit at the context surrounding it. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul discusses his rights as an apostle. In chapter 7 and in chapter 8, he discusses the rights of marriage and the rights that individuals have to marry. And he discusses in chapter 8 the right that people in this time had to eat meat sacrificed to idols. They had that right to eat meat. But he advised them in chapter 8, just because you have the right to eat this meat that is sacrificed to idols doesn't mean you should use it. You see, people in this time were confused on whether they should eat meat sacrificed to idols or not. And that may be something we don't really understand in our culture and climate today, but the message still stands. If we do something that we even have a right to, but it distracts from Jesus and it distracts from the cross that we talked about this morning, we shouldn't use that right. Paul talks about in chapter 9 his rights as an apostle, and he talks about how he hasn't used some of these rights simply because he doesn't want anything to get in the way of the cross. In verse 12, he says, "If others share this rightful claim on you, do we not even more? Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ." We talk so often how we as Christians need to have self-control. We need to make sure we don't sin and have self-control in our lives so we can live the best lives possible. But I think sometimes we neglect to talk about how, yes, we need to be self-controlled in our sins, but we need to be aware of our rights and how we are using them. Are we using our rights to glorify God, or are we using them to cause division and to stir up discord in the body of Christ? So before we really dig into chapter 9, let's just talk a little bit about the broader context of 1 Corinthians and its place in chapter 9's place in the book. So in the book of 1 Corinthians, this is sometimes called the Corinthian correspondence. 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians are. If you look in Acts chapter 18, we see that Paul has spent a considerable amount of time in Corinth. He evangelized in Corinth and spent a year and 6 months there. He spent time in Corinth. He's evangelized in this community. He spent time knowing the church. He loves the Corinthian church. And so everything he says in this letter, he's saying out of a place of love and out of a sincere evangelistic standpoint to bring people to Christ and to help people live the best life they can for Jesus. He deeply loved the church at Corinth. The overall theme in this book is unity and order in the church because of the gospel of Christ. In 1 Corinthians, it can be sometimes hard to see, is there a theme? Like, what's the continuing thread, the continuing theme that goes through this book? It can be hard to find sometimes because it just seems like Paul's just addressing different things. But if you really look at it, every issue that Paul brings up into the church of Corinth, if it's sexual immorality, if it's something with the Lord's Supper or how we worship, he points back to the gospel. He points back to the cross. Everything goes back to the gospel. Every problem points back to Jesus, and nothing surpasses the cross. Paul stressed that we should seek to be holy in light of the cross. That is what 1 Corinthians is really about. That is what Paul is trying to teach. Now that we kind of see what's going on in 1 Corinthians, in chapter 7 and 8, the chapter is building up to chapter 9. Paul gives advice for the married and gives advice to those thinking about being married. And in this passage, Paul gives different advice. He tells some people, because of this present time, maybe you should wait to get married. It's not a commandment, but it's my recommendation. And Paul discusses a lot of things about marriage, but the main point he gets at is serve the Lord in your capacity. One thing he mentions in verse 17 of chapter 7, let me flip there. Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. So while Paul doesn't say directly, hey, let's all make sure we're just living for Jesus to the best of our ability. He doesn't say it that plainly, but if you read 1 Corinthians and you read chapter 7, you see that Paul's main point is for married people and for anybody is just live the life you are called to live and live by your means. Live where you are planted. He tells bondservants even, and this is crazy to us today because we're a country that's very big about freedom, which is great. But Paul's writing to people who are bondservants, and he says, bondservants, I wish you would remain as you are, and just so you can serve the Lord. He says, if you have the opportunity to be free, great, but just serve the Lord in your capacity. Wherever we are in our lives, no matter who we are and what situation we're in, we need to serve Jesus in our capacity. That's what this is about. I hate to say it, but in this area, oftentimes we have so many different churches that people just think, well, I'm just going to go around and go to this church. Well, I'm going to go to this church. Well, I don't like what they're doing. I'm going to go to this church. And I think that's unwise. Now, one thing I find very interesting about the church at Corinth is they had a lot of issues. You had people doing terrible things to each other and treating each other very wrongly. But never once did Paul say, you should split off and start a church somewhere else. Never once does he say that. Let us remember how important unity is to the body of Christ and how desperately we need each other and how much God wants us to be together as the family of God. But in chapter 7 and even in chapter 8, all his points go back to live for Jesus, live for the cross of Christ. And in chapter 8 is where we get to some of the discussion I want to get to. He's discussing confusion over meat being sacrificed to idols. Some people were disturbed by eating this meat, and some people, they weren't. They're just like, hey, God has said everything's clean. I can eat what I want. But some people thought that sacrificing something to an idol was horrible. It was sacrilegious. It was evil. But Paul says, now we know that meat being sacrificed to idol, it doesn't mean anything because this idol isn't real. Only God is real. It doesn't matter what you eat. But Paul goes to say, just because you know something is okay and someone else is bothered by it, doesn't give you the right to push your beliefs on them. It doesn't give you the right to lord it over them. In 1 Corinthians 8, verse 1, he says, now concerning food offered to idols, we know that all of us possess knowledge. This knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. And that's the theme of chapter 8 is let's choose love over knowledge. Let's choose to live for Jesus above all else. If you look down in verse 8, this thought continues. Food will not be commended to us to God. This is chapter 8, verse 8. Food will not commend us to God. We are no worse off if we do not eat and no better off if we do. But take care, and listen to this, but take care that this right of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. For if anyone sees you who have the knowledge eating in an idol's temple, will he not be encouraged if his conscience is weak to eat food offered to idols? And so by your knowledge, this weak person is destroyed, the brother for whom Christ died. You see, he ties this all back to Jesus. He says, yes, you may have a right to something, but if it takes them away from Christ, it's not worth pursuing. I think sometimes we struggle, especially in this culture where we have so many rights, we have so many freedoms, and what a blessing that is. But sometimes we get so caught up in thinking that our rights as a country are our same rights as a Christian, and we always want what we want, and we want to do what we want, and we want to have these freedoms, but we forget about the weaker brother. We forget about those who just need Jesus. He goes on in verse 12, thus sinning against your brothers and wounding their conscience when it is weak. You sin against Christ. Therefore, if food makes my brothers stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. You see, and this is all building up to a point he's getting to in chapter 9. Nothing is worth making another stumble. When I was reading this passage, I was thinking, what meat would they not be eating? It's meat sacrificed to idols. So I was thinking, well, my favorite meat is like steak. I think everybody, any person who really enjoys food really likes steak. At least they should. At least that's what I believe. But that's me pushing my right to believe that. I'm sorry. But I believe steak is great. And would I be willing to give up steak for a brother? Woo, that's pretty hard. I love some Texas Roadhouse ribeye. It's going to be hard to give up that. But I was thinking more broadly, what is our meat, quote unquote? What are some rights that we are not willing to surrender? Some of these people were like, I like this meat sacrificed to idols. I want to eat it. But they weren't willing to surrender it. And we need to be willing to surrender our rights. So what meat, if you're following my metaphor, are we not willing to surrender? As I said before, we discussed the practice of self-control and discipline when it comes to sin, but what about when it comes to exercising our rights? In chapter 9, if you look at verse 4, he's talking about his apostleship, and a little bit here he's defending his apostleship because you had people in the community saying, I'm not sure if this Paul guy's an apostle. They doubted that because he was preaching the truth. And so he defends himself there a little bit, but in verse 4 he says, do we not have the right to eat and drink? And so he's addressing back to chapter 8. And he addresses back to chapter 7, and he says, do we not have the right to take on a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? You see, he's defending his apostleship by saying, if I'm not an apostle, why am I denying myself all these great privileges? Why am I denying myself a wife? Why am I denying myself the ability to eat meat? Because of the cross, because I love my brothers, because I want unity and peace so we can all go to heaven. That's what Paul's pursuing here. And so in this defense, he lists things that he has a right to do, but he doesn't because he does not want to do anything. Like he says in verse 12, he doesn't want to put any obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. He even goes as far to say that he's not willing to be paid in verse 6. Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? You see here, and it's convenient that a preacher is talking about this, but Paul's writing here that he has a right to be provided physical means because he's providing spiritual guidance. He says in verse 9, for it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. It is for the oxen. Is it for the oxen that God is concerned? Verse 10, does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things among you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more? And then here it is again. Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel. So all these rights he has, he even says these rights are good. These rights are something that are, in the eyes of God, something that he commands, something that he wants. But he doesn't take advantage of them, so he doesn't block the gospel. Nothing should interfere with people's view of the cross of Christ. We have a lot of tall people in this auditorium with us, and not to point any fingers, there's some really tall people. I'm not even going to say their name, but you know who it is. And if you've ever sat behind them, they tend to sit in this general vicinity of the auditorium. If you ever sit behind them, sometimes it can be a little frustrating because you can't see over them. They're simply sitting in front of you, and it's like, I can't see anything. This guy's so tall. I think he likes basketball or something as well. But it's frustrating when you have someone in front of you who's tall and you can't see who's preaching. You can't see. If you're watching a movie, I've had people sit in front of me and they're so tall I can't even see the movie. You have people who are tall who interfere with what's in front of you. Paul's saying, don't be like that in front of the cross of Christ. Don't be this tall guy that's blocking your view. Don't let your own ideas and don't let your own rights, your own opinions block from the cross of Christ. Do not let anything get in the way of the cross of Christ. So I ask again, what meat are we willing to surrender for others? And as I was thinking about this, like, what rights do we have in today's world that would apply to this? And the first thing I thought of was honestly the freedom of speech. And we do have that freedom. I think that's a great freedom. But we need to be careful how we treat that. And then what I'm thinking about is social media. Right now, every single person in this room has a voice. They can post any thought that they've ever had on Facebook. And I know some people who will just post whatever thought they have and not think anything about it. Just because you have a right to say something, just because you have the ability to say something, does not mean you should use it. You should think about, how is this going to be interpreted? How will this affect others? How will this bring people to Christ? Or how will this hinder people? Again, as I said at the beginning, you may be the only reference point that people have to Christ. Some people will never open their Bibles. Some people will never come into contact with good Christian people. We may be the only people. We may be the only reference point to Christ. So let's be careful how we use our freedoms. Let's be careful what we just say on social media to stir up division or to hurt people's feelings. Same thing with opinions. Let's all be careful. We all have strong opinions. Believe me, I have strong opinions. If you're from Alabama and support the Crimson Tide, you have to have some strong opinions to move up here. But let us all be careful about those opinions as to not disrupt someone else's faith and block what is most important, the salvation that comes from Jesus. Second thing I thought about is what we wear. Everyone has a different opinion on what you should wear. And one thing I honestly thought about is what you wear to church. A few years ago, everybody wore a similar thing, but it seems culturally some of those ideas are changing. But we need to be careful because everybody has a view of it, and we don't want to really be super strict on either or super enforceful on either. We need to make sure we're just focusing on Jesus. So with things we wear, we have a freedom to wear what we want. But let's consider how it would make another person feel or how it would distract from what is most important. The other thing I thought of is what media we put into our brains. We have so many options of entertainment, too many options for entertainment, in my opinion. And different people have different opinions on what you should watch and what you shouldn't watch. Some people think you shouldn't watch anything. But let us be careful what we do in everything so as to make sure we do not block from the cross of Christ. Another thing I thought of is just in general, our own culture. We love American culture. We love this country, and that is great. But are we too caught up in our own culture to relate to someone else from a different culture? Are we too caught up in what we want and what we're used to that we can't evangelize to someone else? I've been on mission trips where people think they can just take the American evangelism style and the American church and just push it on someone else. That doesn't work. Some people are much more reserved than others. Some cultures are much more reserved, and we can't just go in guns a-blazing, sometimes literally, and try to get people to understand the gospel. We need to try to relate to those people. If someone comes to my house, I hope they would follow the rules that I put in place. Some people say, hey, take off your shoes before you step into the house. Some people don't care at all. But you would respect whatever rule they had because you're in their house. Sometimes we can let our own culture that we're proud of get in the way of the cross. Sometimes we can't relate to people. I've seen people who've tried so hard to evangelize to someone so aggressively that the person they were trying to evangelize to was so uncomfortable that they couldn't see Jesus. They couldn't understand the gospel because they were so uncomfortable. I've gone on trips, this wasn't even evangelism, but I've gone in other countries and seen people in touristy areas act so contrary to the culture that it's just so awkward and people are just uncomfortable by them. So let's be careful that our own culture doesn't get in the way of Jesus. Sometimes we can violate a cultural law so that no matter what we say next to defend ourselves, it won't matter. I've been married for a year. I think Mr. Dan said he's been married about 62 years, I believe. So it's a few more years more than me, I think. But one thing I've learned in this year of marriage is that different families have different rules, and that my wife and her family have a very specific rule about cereal, apparently. I did not know this. I was at my in-laws' house one time, and I got a cereal box. I put it on the table, and I took the bag out, and I poured it into the bowl. And I looked at my sister-in-law and my wife's face, and they said, "What are you doing? Are you crazy? You don't take the bag out of the box. You just open the bag and then pour it from the box." And no matter what I said to console them, saying, "Well, this is what I've done. It's fine." They said, "That is crazy. That is weird. Never do that again." And so that's a silly example, but truly, if we're not aware of the rules of someone else's culture or what someone thinks is the norm and do something very abnormal, no matter what we say, they're not going to listen because they're so used to something else. So don't let your own norms, your own culture get in the way of the cross. Now finally, I can wrap up and lead to some application. I think this all ties back to 19 through 27. I'd just like to read this passage. This is chapter 9, verse 19. "For though I am free from all," he's mentioned all these things that he has the right to, but yet he doesn't accept any of them. "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I may win more of them. To the Jews I became a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings." No culture, no person, in Paul's eyes, stood in the way of the gospel. No culture that he couldn't try to adapt to. No person that he couldn't try to evangelize to. It's so important that we remember the gospel above all else. What's interesting about this passage is Paul was a Jew, but he was a Jew culturally. He grew up in that culture, but he was a Jewish convert. And yet he was called to evangelize to the Gentiles. You think that would have been hard to try to adapt to Jews who are following a rule that you know is wrong, or to try to evangelize to Gentiles who've lived a lifestyle that's so contrary to what you grew up in? I think Paul has a lot of experience with evangelizing to people who are different than him. But you know what he says? He says, "I can do these things because I serve them." And that's what it is. Service is the key. We must be willing to serve others so we can help them see the cross of Christ. Are you struggling to relate to someone? Serve them. You don't like someone? You have trouble relating to them? Serve them. Help them. Get to know them so that you can show them the gospel of Christ. Don't insist on your own opinions in your own culture. Paul didn't let another person's culture or background, even though they were so different than his, he didn't let those things interfere with the message of the gospel. In verse 24 down to the end, he talks about this race. He says, "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified." Paul talks about here, I'm doing all these things for the gospel. I'm serving these people. I'm getting to them because of the gospel. And then he reminds them, do you not know that we're in this race of life, and we do it for eternal life? It is worth self-control of your own rights. It is worth self-discipline to watch your mouth for the gospel, so you can bring others to Jesus. I think it's very interesting that he says that he runs a race, but only one receives the prize. So run that you may obtain it. He's saying run to get first place. He's not saying just run to compete. He says run to get first place. Have you ever seen an Olympic athlete's training schedule? Sometimes, I love the Olympics, I think it's fun. So I will look up, what does this trainer do? And it's hours. They spend their life dedicating themselves, disciplining themselves to run a race where they're just going to receive a silly wreath or a medal. But we're in a race for eternity. We're in this life to get to heaven, and we want to bring as many others as well. And so we can't let anything get in the way of eternity. We can't distract from the cross of Christ. I think some ways we can practice self-denial is to ask ourselves some questions. Is how often do we insist on our own way? When we look back at our lives, let's just say that's too much. Let's look back at our week and let's say, how many times did I insist on something I could have let up on? Or how often have I been uncomfortable while sharing my faith? Which of course leads to another question is, how often have you tried to share your faith? Are we proactive? Are we striving to relate to people and bring them to Christ? Or are we so comfortable where we're at that we're not even willing to deny our rights of comfort to bring others to Jesus? In Romans chapter 14, he echoes something very similar to what he said in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. In verse 14, starting in 18 and down to 20, it says, "Whoever thus serves Christ is acceptable to God and approved by men. So then, let us pursue what makes for peace and for mutual upbuilding. Do not, for the sake of food, destroy the work of God. Everything is indeed clean, but it is wrong for anyone to make another stumble by what he eats. Again, do not, for the sake of food, destroy the work of God." Not distract it, not pull it away. Destroy the work of God. Fill in that, do not for the sake of food. What if we replace that, for the sake of your opinion, for the sake of what you want to say, for the sake of my comfort? For the sake of any of those things, destroy the work of God. Everything is indeed clean, but it is wrong to make another stumble by what he, and then fill it in. Nothing, not even our own rights, can distract us from the cross of Christ and distract others from seeing Jesus. This Christian life is not easy, and I do not live it perfectly. Please don't think I'm here thinking I've got it all figured out, because I do not. I struggle. The other day I tried, I had an idea. I was like, well, what if I just kept a journal and just asked people, what can I pray for you today? And just write it down. That's so easy. I went to a coffee shop and tried to do it. I couldn't even do it. I was too afraid. The social pressure was just too much. But am I willing to let social pressure take away from the opportunity to bring someone to Jesus? Am I so selfish that I can't even take a little bit of awkwardness to ask if I can pray for somebody? I think if I struggle with that, I'm sure others do. At least I hope they do, or else I'm going to be very lonely. This Christian life is hard, but we are called to such a degree of holiness, to such a degree of action, that to deny it is a terrible travesty. We must all remember the importance of the gospel and live the life that Jesus is called to live, and never let anything get in the way of the cross. We're gathered together as a body of believers who love each other, but most importantly, who love God. We all want to see each other in heaven. We sing a song so often, when we all get to heaven. Sometimes it seems that we don't want to do that because of how we treat each other, but we do. We all want to see each other in heaven. We all want to see each other in eternity. We're a body of believers who love each other. If there's any struggle that anyone is having in this room today, if there's any concern, if there's any worry, we're here to help you. We're here to love you. We're here to point you to Jesus. There's nothing you should be afraid to share, because we love you and we want you to be more like Jesus. If there's anything you need, if you just need encouragement, it's easy to get bogged down and concerned. It's easy to be distressed by life. But this body of believers loves you and wants to serve you. If you want to be baptized, if there's anything you need, please come forward now as we stand and as we sing.